What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and you're watching our college football channel. It's time for my Week 5 Top 25. Yes, we are heading into Week 5. Season already a third of the way over for most teams. It's going by quick, and we'll get into my Top 25. If you're new and you haven't watched the other videos, we're basing this just off of the performance this season. So based off of the 4 games that we have seen, that's how I'm ranking these teams. It's not a resume ranking, but I do use the resume for like tiebreakers, and I think that's where people can get confused. If I think 2 teams are pretty similar, I'm going to go to the resume. If I can't really figure out if a team should be ranked higher than another, that's when I like to look at the resume. And I always say after the first 4 games, now we really know about these teams. We know for the most part. There are still some teams that are probably going to be overrated, some teams that are going to be underrated. But for the most part, we know about the teams now. And I talked about this in my takeaways video. It's starting to really look like I thought it was going to look. Go back and look at my preseason expectations for these teams. All the teams are pretty much about where I expected them to be outside of Michigan State and Miami. Those are the 2 teams that I really overrated. But I think the top 25 this week, and I said this in the other videos in the previous weeks, I said that this is not a good top 25. We don't have enough information to make a good top 25. I think now we finally can. I think we can make a good top 25. Sure, you're going to have some arguments, but I think that this is a pretty solid top 25, and I can say that for the first time this season. Let's jump right into it. 21 through 25. All right, so I've got BYU at number 25. They are 3-1. They still have a nice win over Baylor. They had a little bit of a slow start this past week. But this is still a team that the resume is enough because of the win over Baylor. That's enough to get them in the top 25. Wake Forest at 24. They are also 3-1. And that's the thing with a lot of these teams. So from Kansas down, and the teams that I consider, and I think I had 14 teams, and I'll show them to you, that I considered, that's when it comes down to resume. So I think that Florida and Texas are probably better than Kansas. But I think it's pretty close based off of what I've seen so far. And Kansas has a better resume. They have no losses. They're 4-0. So that's the difference here. Kansas and Kansas State, I think they're pretty similar. Kansas has the better resume because they are 4-0. They don't have a loss. So again, resume does come into play here, but I'm not basing my rankings totally off of resumes. Kansas State with a very impressive win over Oklahoma. Maybe Oklahoma isn't as good as we thought. I still believe that we know enough to know that Oklahoma is a good team based off of, if nothing else, just what they did in Nebraska, and Kansas State really took it to them. That was an impressive win. I think it's safe to say that they were maybe overlooking Tulane a little bit. Kansas at 22, just talked about them. You know, the West Virginia win looks better now after seeing West Virginia dominate Virginia Tech, who hasn't been good, but still it's a Power 5 team. And then in Kansas, you know, they beat them. They win this Saturday against a Duke team was 3-0. I mean, don't really know a ton about them either, but it's enough for me to rank Kansas. I believe Kansas should be ranked, and I've got them at 4-0. Again, 2 Power 5 wins for them. Ole Miss at number 21. I still go back to that Georgia Tech performance. They looked really good in that game. I know they didn't look great against Tulsa, but the Georgia Tech win, again, another team that's been playing pretty terribly, but the beating Georgia Tech the way that they did, that was enough for me. And, you know, they haven't had any real struggles. I know Tulsa was a pretty close game, not a horrible team. And so I still got Ole Miss ranked here. They're 4-0, and they are number 21. I did drop them a lot. I think we had them in the top 10 last week. 16 through 20, Utah at 3-1. They haven't really played anyone since Florida, but that was such a close game on the road, and they've just completely dominated in their other games against lesser competition. They do have a Power 5 win now. Arkansas there at number 19. Tough loss to Texas A&M, who I have at 18. If you go back and watch that game, Arkansas, I believe, was the better team. But this is a case where both teams are 3-1. Texas A&M won the head-to-head, so Texas A&M deserves to be ranked ahead of Arkansas. And that's, again, why I say sometimes the resumes have to make the tiebreaker decisions here. And that's kind of the story with these teams: LSU, Syracuse, Texas A&M, Arkansas, Utah. Utah doesn't have a great win. That's why they're behind these teams. LSU has a really nice win over Mississippi State. That's why they're at number 16. And their one loss came to Florida State, who I have ranked higher. You'll see them in just a minute. Syracuse at 4-0. Kind of a tough one because all their games have been so close. I know they did beat Louisville easily, but a close win over Purdue, a close win over Virginia. it's just hard to know about Syracuse if this team is for real or not. And like I said earlier, we do know about the teams for the most part now, but there are still some questions. Syracuse definitely a question mark. Kansas still a question mark. If they are a top 25 team, they should beat Iowa State on Saturday, and we'll find out what happens there. But 16 through 20 here. Again, LSU's one loss came to Florida State in a very, very close game, and I'm very high on Florida State. So that's what I've got here for 16 through 20. Moving on through 11 through 15. Oregon's my top-ranked one-loss team, and it kind of makes sense because their one loss came to the best team in college football in Georgia. They sit here at 3-1. Really impressed with their win against Washington State. The way they were able to come back in that game. And Washington State is arguably a top 25 team. I think they're close to a top 25 team. I was impressed with that. Impressed with their win. A really easy win over BYU. So Oregon right there at 15. I think they're the best one-loss team in the country right now. Oklahoma State at 14 at 3-0. Didn't play this past Saturday. Still need to know some things about them. They have looked a little shaky at times, not as consistent. And the same thing could be said about Kentucky. Kentucky has not looked great against lesser competition. They haven't just dominated these games. They didn't do that on Saturday. So I had to drop them. I mean, if you were looking at the performance this year, the Florida win was great, but their other games have not been super impressive. They haven't won those games like you would expect a top 10 team to win them. So based off of what I've seen in Kentucky, I'm sorry, I have to drop them down to 13. Oklahoma State, kind of a similar situation there. Like, look at Arizona State, who's awful. That was a game that was close in the first half, for really up until the second half. That game was pretty close, and so I need to see Oklahoma State play a good team. I'm not saying Oklahoma State can't be a top 10 team, but I just haven't seen anything that tells me that they for sure are. I know they're a good team, but I'm sorry, Oklahoma State's still at number 14. I know people think I hate Oklahoma State for some reason, but based off of what we've seen this year, I just haven't seen it yet. Minnesota, I had not seen it from them, and I didn't even have them ranked, but now we see them play a decent team in Michigan State. Although Michigan State looks pretty awful right now, I still believe that they're a decent team. I think Washington and Minnesota are just good, and so Minnesota all the way up to number 12. NC State at number 11. Had the scare against East Carolina, but they've been cruising ever since then. That win over Texas Tech looks really good now after Texas Tech just beat Texas. So I've got the Wolfpack at number 11. How about 6 through 10? I've got Washington at number 10. Easy win for them this past Saturday. They have the win over Michigan State, so they're looking really good, looking like a top 10 team. Florida State also looking like a top 10 team. They rolled over Boston College. Give them a lot of credit for that win over Louisville after Jordan Travis went down with the injury. This Florida State team, I think, is the real deal. Florida State teams of the past, they would have won this game against Boston College and they would have struggled. They would have had a close game. That's not what we saw at all. They are looking really, really good. USC at number 8. They dropped for me a little bit. If you look at the big picture, they didn't completely dominate Stanford, who now just doesn't look very good. Washington, of course, blowing them out. And then the Oregon State game. Yes, Oregon State, tough place to play. Quality team, but a top 5 team I don't think would struggle that much. Although you could say, look at Alabama on the road at Texas, a 2-loss Texas team. They struggled. So I get it. I understand the argument for USC to be ranked in the top 5 or maybe even lower than 8. It's just they're a team that we have a lot of question marks. We kind of know more about Alabama. USC, the offense, the one thing that we thought, they had the offense no matter what. We thought that they could score on anybody. That's the strength of this team, and they just didn't look great against Oregon State. The defense is really why they won the game. Some turnovers. They were lucky to win that game, though, and so that's why I've dropped them down to number 8. Penn State at number 7, a little bit of a shaky performance for them, but they were coming off of a huge win on the road at Auburn, and so that's to be expected. And really, if you look at this, if you look at all these teams, there's not a team in the country that hasn't struggled at least for a half of football. I mean, every single team has had some issues at times, and so you can't just point and say, well, I can't. This team shouldn't be ranked this high because they struggled in this game or they struggled for a half a game or whatever. Every team has struggled, and so that's what makes it a little bit easier. After 4 games, you have a bigger sample size. When you've only played 2 games and you struggled in one of those, then you're saying, oh, this team's not very good. But now that you have maybe 4 games and they only struggled in one of the 4, hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, I think that Penn State still looks like a top 10 team. Clemson at number 6. intriguing team because the offense is starting to click now. But they were playing a bad Wake Forest defense. The defense looked terrible, but they were playing a really good Wake Forest offense. So was it just Wake Forest or is it the team? I know they have some starters out on defense. You could also, though, look back at Louisiana Tech. The defense didn't play great in that game either. Clemson, I think, still has potential to be a playoff team this year, but I don't know that they've looked like one yet. The pieces are there. You can see it, but it's kind of hard to figure out where to rank them. So it kind of comes back to resume. They have the win over a top 25 Wake Forest team, and that's enough to put Clemson there at number 6. Going to the top 5 now, and so this is where another place where we're using the resume, Tennessee and Michigan. I think these two teams look very similar. Both teams have dominated lesser competition, and then again, when they played quality teams, they've won some pretty close games. Tennessee won a close game against Pitt. They won a close game against Florida. Michigan won a close game against Maryland. So, yeah, these teams to me look very similar right now. And so with the resume, Tennessee has 2 quality wins. Michigan only has 1. That's why I bumped Tennessee up to number 4. Explosive offense like we knew they would have. Defense still maybe with some work to do. But this looks like a really good team and possibly the team that has the best chance of maybe knocking off Alabama this year. Michigan at number 5. Tweaked the defense in the second half, looked a lot better. They struggled on defense in that first half. Blake Corum was the star of this game. J.J. McCarthy finally getting tested. And I'll tell you what, J.J. McCarthy has some work to do. I did not see a guy that looked like one of the best quarterbacks in the country. Holding the ball too long, inaccurate on some throws down the field, just not in command of the offense against a quality team. He'll get better. I'm not panicking if I'm a Michigan fan. It was his first start against, again, a quality team. The tools are there. I think he has a great chance to bounce back and play much better. The stats were actually good for him, but like I say, just kind of some of the things, command of the offense and just holding on to the ball too long, taking some sacks that he just didn't need to take. Those things will hurt them against Iowa. We'll see if he can play better. But Michigan overall as a team looking really, really good still. And Maryland's a good team. That was a good win for them. Alabama, number 3, they are 4-0, and we now see that the Texas game was a bit of a fluke. Like I said, all the teams have struggled at some point this season, even Georgia, which we'll talk about. Alabama, though, in their other 3 games have looked dominant. Vanderbilt has proven this year that they're not terrible like they have been in the past, and Alabama went out and completely dominated that game. So I think we can put Alabama back into the top 3. Ohio State really impressive against Wisconsin. The offense put on a show once again. They look like the second best team in the country. Their only struggles really were in that first game against Notre Dame. Since then, the offense especially has really been rolling. Georgia at number 1, still the best team in the country. I know that they struggled a little bit this past Saturday, but when they've had a big game, when it's been Oregon or South Carolina, they have completely dominated. So I'm just going to say that they were not totally focused for that game. If they play like that again, then I maybe start to worry about Georgia, and maybe they weren't as good as we thought. But one game, yeah, even the second game they played, I can't remember now who they played. It was against a cupcake team, but they didn't look super great in that game either. It was like 31-0 or something. So I'm not concerned about Georgia. We'll see how they play when they get back into SEC competition. So those are my top 25 teams after week 4. Other teams I considered, and as I was recording this video, I thought Maryland really should have been on here too, because Maryland is 3-1, and they played Michigan pretty tough, so I'm sorry, Maryland fans. But TCU, UCLA, James Madison, Coastal Carolina, all 4 of those teams undefeated. Oklahoma, I mean, you lose to Kansas State. They have the win over Nebraska, but I just don't know how much credit we can give them for that win. That's kind of where I'm struggling right now with Oklahoma, so I want to see them play again. Baylor, just the one loss. They're right there on the edge of my top 25. Cincinnati, same thing. Texas Tech, they also, I think, could definitely be considered. Their one loss came to NC State, who was ranked. They have a win over Texas now. Mississippi State, just waiting on them to get a big win. If they beat Texas A&M, maybe that puts them into the top 25. Or it will, I think. Pitt, right there, they're close. I mean, these teams are all really, really close. Oregon State and Washington State, even though they lost, they look good. They look like they are potentially top 25 teams. And then Florida and Texas, even with the 2 losses, I think have to at least be considered when you look at who they've lost to. Texas lost on the road against a good Texas Tech team, and then they lost to Alabama. They've looked pretty solid this year. Florida has played a really tough schedule. They do have a win over Utah, and then their 2 losses coming to Kentucky and Tennessee, top 10, top 15 teams. So even though they do have the 2 losses, Florida, I think, still has to be considered. So these are the teams that I'm keeping an eye on, and maybe throw Maryland in that conversation as well. I would love to get your thoughts on my top 25. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Give me your top 25. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports College Football Channel.